The cabin stood alone, nestled deep in the untamed wilderness of northwest Montana. Surrounded by a sea of towering pines and endless stretches of white, it was a forgotten place, one that had not seen human visitors in years. The biting cold and the snowstorm that had been forecast promised nothing short of isolation. For the 5 friends who had made the journey out here, that was the appeal. No phones, no distractions, no intrusions, just the quiet of nature and the warmth of old companionship. Jacob, the de facto leader of the group, was the first to suggest the trip. He had always been the steady one, the glue that held their group together after college, keeping everyone in touch, organizing reunions like this one. Life had pulled them in different directions, but Jacob believed that with enough effort, the bonds of their younger years could still be maintained. This trip was supposed to be a reconnection, a chance to rekindle the camaraderie they'd once shared. The others had been on board immediately. Mark, Jacob's oldest friend, was excited to escape the office grind for a few days. Sarcastic and quick-witted, he had a way of making light of even the darkest situations. Chris, the outdoorsman of the group, loved the idea of returning to nature. He had found the cabin through an old hiking buddy and was thrilled to finally explore the backcountry during the dead of winter. Aaron, quieter and more reserved, was content to join simply because he trusted Jacob's judgment. And then there was Paul, the youngest, eager to impress the older men, eager to prove he could handle the harsh conditions and keep up with the veterans of their friendship. The 5 men had arrived late on a Friday evening, just as the sun began to dip below the mountain peaks. A long drive had brought them to the edge of civilization, and from there, it was another 2 hours on rough, snow-covered roads. The cabin was small but sturdy, built to withstand the brutal winters of Montana. Its rough wooden walls were thick, and the windows small, but the inside was surprisingly cozy. A wood-burning stove in the corner cast a warm glow over the room, and the smell of pine from the stacked firewood filled the air. They were in high spirits that first night. The storm outside had begun to pick up, but they paid it no mind. Huddled around the fire, drinks in hand, they swapped stories and joked about the ridiculousness of their situation. Snowed in for the weekend? No problem. They had enough food, wood, and whiskey to last them until the roads were cleared. But when morning came, the tone of their little vacation began to shift. The world outside had disappeared, swallowed whole by the storm. Snow had piled up against the cabin walls, covering the windows and blocking the door. They had expected snow, of course, but not this much, not this fast. What was supposed to be a light snowfall had turned into a blizzard, and there was no sign of it letting up. "We'll be fine," Jacob reassured everyone over breakfast, as they peered out through a crack in the door they'd managed to force open. "We're stocked up, and it's just a matter of waiting it out. This storm can't last forever." But as the hours turned into days, the endless white landscape outside began to feel less like a winter wonderland and more like a prison. The sky remained a dull, colorless gray, and the snow kept falling. They were completely cut off. By the 3rd day, the mood inside the cabin had shifted drastically. The playful banter that had filled the air during their first night was gone, replaced by silence and tension. Chris, always the optimist, had suggested they dig their way out, but after hours of shoveling through waist-high snow, they'd barely made a dent. Every time they cleared a path, more snow piled up behind them, as if the storm was mocking their efforts. "It's no use," Chris muttered, throwing the shovel aside. His breath came in heavy puffs, visible in the freezing air. "We're not going anywhere." Jacob agreed, though he didn't say it out loud. He could see the doubt in Chris's eyes, the weariness beginning to take hold. They were isolated, and the worst part was that no one knew exactly where they were. Chris's hiking buddy who had recommended the cabin had given vague directions, and in their eagerness to start their adventure, none of them had thought to leave a detailed itinerary with anyone back home. Mark tried to keep the mood light, cracking jokes about how they'd be the subject of some true crime documentary if they ever got out of this mess. But the humor fell flat. No one laughed, not really. Even Mark himself seemed unsettled. The walls of the cabin were closing in on them. Aaron, who had been the quietest of the group from the start, had become even more withdrawn. He sat by the fire most of the time, staring into the flames, saying little. The others left him alone, figuring that was just how Aaron dealt with stress. Paul, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. The youngest of the group, he felt like he had something to prove, even now. He volunteered for every task, offered to go outside to check on the snow or gather more firewood. But his bravado seemed forced, a thin veil over the growing unease that was settling over them all. That night, the storm raged on outside, the wind howling like a living thing. Inside, the fire crackled softly, but the warmth felt fragile, like it could disappear at any moment. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. By the fourth day, the real cracks began to show. Chris had started pacing near the windows, peering out into the blizzard as if he could will the storm to stop with sheer determination. His once steady demeanor had frayed, and the constant pacing was getting on everyone's nerves. "We have to do something," Chris said for the 10th time that morning, his voice tight with frustration. "We can't just sit here waiting to die." "No one's dying," Jacob replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "The storm will pass." "And what if it doesn't?" Chris shot back. "What if no one comes looking for us?" "That's not going to happen," Jacob insisted, but Chris's words had planted seeds of doubt in everyone's minds. The tension in the cabin thickened with each passing hour. Every small inconvenience, a misplaced item, a late meal, a loud noise, became a source of irritation. Little by little, the camaraderie that had brought them together began to unravel. By the 5th day, paranoia had taken root. It started with Mark. He had been quiet all morning, sitting at the table, staring at the small pantry in the corner of the cabin. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "I've been keeping track of the food," he said, his eyes flicking from one man to the next. "There's less than there should be." "What are you talking about?" Jacob asked, frowning. Mark leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "Someone's been eating more than their share. I've seen it." "Come on, man, that's ridiculous," Chris scoffed. "We're all eating the same." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Are we?" "I've been watching. Every time someone goes to the pantry, there's a little less than there should be. Someone's hoarding food." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. No one said anything for a long moment, the fire crackling softly in the background. "That's insane," Paul finally muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Mark's face twisted into a bitter smile. "Is it? Or are you the one sneaking extra rations, Paul?" Paul's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? No. I'm not." "Enough," Jacob snapped, standing up from his seat. "No one's hoarding food. We're all in this together, remember?" But the damage had already been done. The suspicion, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. By the 6th day, the madness had set in. Chris, who had always been the most level-headed of the group, had stopped pacing. Instead, he had taken to standing near the window, staring out into the snowstorm with a strange intensity. He barely spoke to the others anymore, and when he did, his words were cryptic, muttered under his breath. "They're out there," he whispered one night, as the wind howled outside. "I've seen them." "Seen who?" Jacob asked, his patience wearing thin. Chris turned to him, his eyes wild. "There's someone out there. Watching us. Waiting for us to make a mistake." Jacob stared at him, unsure of how to respond. Chris had always been the rational one, the outdoorsman who loved the wilderness. But now, he looked like a man on the edge of something far darker. "No one's out there, Chris," Jacob said gently. "It's just the storm." But Chris shook his head, his eyes wide and unblinking. "You're wrong. They're out there. I can feel it." That night, no one slept. The wind howled outside, the walls creaked, and inside the cabin, the 5 men sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire, once a source of warmth and comfort, now seemed small and weak against the encroaching cold. By the 7th day, it all fell apart. It started with Paul. The youngest of the group, he had always been eager to prove himself, but the isolation and the growing tension had worn him down. That morning, he snapped. "You're all lying." Paul screamed, standing in the middle of the cabin, his face flushed with anger. "You're trying to drive me crazy." "Calm down, Paul," Jacob said, trying to keep his voice steady. "No one's trying to drive you crazy." But Paul wasn't listening. His eyes darted from face to face, wild with fear and suspicion. "I know what you're doing. You're trying to make me look like the weak one so you can get rid of me." "Paul, that's not true," Aaron said quietly, but his words did nothing to calm him. Without warning, Paul lunged at Chris, tackling him to the ground. The two men wrestled on the floor, fists flying, while the others scrambled to pull them apart. In the chaos, a knife appeared. No one knew where it came from, but in the end, it was Paul who lay bleeding on the cabin floor, his body still. The room fell silent, the only sound the wind outside and the soft crackling of the fire. Chris stood over Paul's body, the knife still in his hand, his chest heaving with adrenaline. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "I didn't mean to." But before he could finish, Jacob tackled him, sending them both crashing into the fireplace. The flames roared up around them, the heat unbearable, as they struggled on the ground. In the chaos, the fire spread, catching on the dry wood stacked nearby. Aaron, who had been sitting by the fire all week, mumbling to himself, didn't even react as the flames consumed the cabin. He just stared into the fire, his mind lost to the madness that had taken them all. By morning, the cabin was gone, buried beneath the snow, its walls reduced to charred remnants. There was no sign of the 5 men who had once laughed and shared drinks around the fire, no sign of the friendships that had once seemed unbreakable. In the end, the storm passed, but the men who had come to the cabin for a weekend of bonding never returned. And in the wilderness of northwest Montana, beneath the snow, their story was forgotten.